Morning, class. Welcome to the last day of June. I look forward to starting July with you tomorrow. Let's start with the land acknowledgement. Again, we acknowledge the Tuscarora people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Greenville consumes. We pay respect to 8 recognized tribes: Cohari, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Haliwa Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi Band of Saponi, and Waccamaw Siouan, all nations and their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's good for us to start by thinking about Native Americans in the United States and elsewhere, Canada, all through Latin America as well, because we are finding that there are social disparities that are starting to emerge and are starting to be documented in those groups, both because of the COVID-19 outbreak and the protests against racism. Right now, there are tribal businesses and casinos completely closed, and think about what that does to the tax base of the reservations. So many are left without a tax base. And as of April 30th, the Navajo Nation had the 3rd highest per capita rate of COVID-19 in the country after New Jersey and New York. So worsening the situation, Native Americans appear to have a higher risk of serious complications from COVID because they're likely to suffer from diabetes, heart disease, and other conditions. Another thing that is coming out in the news is that the poor infrastructure on some of the reservations is also making it difficult to deal with the disease because access to clean water is very limited there. I hope you're following the news about this and other vital issues, as this is going to give you more information to help you in applying sociological perspectives. Some announcements. Reminder of the test this week. Check your syllabus. I will have it open starting on Sunday, and I will engage the Lockdown browser. This is my first time to give a test on Canvas. There might be some technical issues, but we will work through those. I'll monitor those for lockouts, so email me if you're locked out. We don't have a proctoring center, so I'm going to have a statement on the test that you're on the honor system, that you've closed all books, notes, devices, other computers, tabs, everything. And the test will cover readings, videos, PowerPoints, everything that I have given you. There will be a new discussion board later this afternoon that'll be up for 48 hours. It's going to be related to research methods, which we're talking about today. And I'm working on getting some extra materials from the publisher up on Canvas for you, and I'll let you know when that is done. I want to follow up on social movements as a bit of a segue into today's discussion about research methods. If our textbook were to be revised right now, what would be in this chapter, right? What about the protests that are going on now and all over the world, not just in the United States? And how would they integrate that into the chapter on social change? But also, there are other protests that have been going on before now, and our memory is forgetting that in the fall, there was a lot of attention to the climate change activist Greta Thunberg from Sweden, which I hope you all heard about, who was at 16 years old, just started her own protest school strike. So she was basically having a sit-in by herself on Fridays to protest climate change. That became a hashtag. It took off. Other students around the world started joining her, and she really struck a chord, and as you know, went on to get a lot of global attention. If you followed this story, she came over to the United States, spoke before Congress, spoke before the United Nations. So that is something that is off our radar, right? Because the news is really consumed with the new strikes and the new protests that are going on now. Also in the fall, there was a whole wave of global protests. Hong Kong, which has been going on for months, as you probably know, led by a lot of young people who are opposed to the growing control of mainland China on Hong Kong, which you probably know used to be a British colony, And so people grew up with a more democratic system there, with a uh, more free market economy, and they were used to certain kinds of rights that mainland China is really clamping down against. So that protest really went on for months, and that is still an issue, even though everyone is locked down like everywhere else right now. There was a wave of protests against Latin America and the Middle East in the fall as well. I was teaching a global understanding class here at ECU, and we had to totally rearrange our links with the partner colleges that we link with in other countries because of the protests that actually closed down some of the universities, like in Egypt. I also want to follow up on something that I had mentioned, which is the importance of the arts in social movements. So this is a really also a good preview to our section on culture because I write about the importance of culture in social movements and therefore social change, right? So there's an interesting documentary about how the song "We Shall Overcome," which you probably have heard, that was very popular in the civil rights movement. I'll sing a bar for you. We shall overcome. My voice is a little raspy. And there's another documentary, a more recent one, about how the song from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is also something that is being used in protests, street protests all over the world. And another one is the song "Do You Hear the People Sing" from the musical and movie Les Miserables, which some of you may have seen. So, what is it about these songs that go viral across protests and seem to be really very motivating, bringing hope, right? Bringing people together. In fact, Beethoven's Ninth was cracked down on in places like Argentina back in the 1970s and 80s when they were under a dictatorship, an authoritarian system, and people were actually banned from playing it. South Africa, the movement against apartheid was very dependent on the music. That was something that brought people to the streets, that inspired them, that actually, where the words themselves were chants, basically. So there was one that I remember called "Free Nelson Mandela" that was actually a great dance song that you heard here in the clubs even. And what this means is the arts are also dangerous. There are poets that get arrested for what they write. And that might not be so common here where we are, but it is in other parts of the world, and it doesn't mean it couldn't happen here. And I bring this up in part because there was sad news this morning that a young Ethiopian singer was shot to death, and they are still investigating why. But he was someone who was holding concerts that also became protest rallies in Ethiopia, and it ended up bringing down a prime minister a few years ago. Another example of the importance of the arts and just how vital they are to some of these movements. I have written about this in several contexts, but one of them is in Turkey. There was a protest in 2013 in a square in the center of Istanbul. And as I mentioned before, I had the opportunity to teach in Istanbul, Turkey for a number of years, which is just an amazing experience. I hope that some of you will get to go there someday. Right now, it's not the best time. There's just a lot of authoritarian rule, even though they're technically a democracy. Their president was elected, but he's taking on some very dictatorial styles. And you'll see some things behind me that come from Turkey. I brought a lot of great Turkish things back with me. And I'm in the room that's full of all my Turkish things. So I was there during the protests in 2013. And what happened was this, that the city, which is a very old city, it goes back to 660 BCE. It was originally Byzantium. You probably read about this in your history books. Then Constantinople. Then it was when the Ottoman Empire was born. That was when the city was conquered and became Istanbul. It's in a very strategic location. It links Europe and Asia, so you can cross the strait there, the river, and go back and forth between Europe and Asia in a few minutes. And it's the Bosphorus Strait links the Black Sea and the Marmara Sea. So it's, as you can probably imagine, really important location across the centuries, and a place that has drawn a lot of people. It's one of the largest cities in the world as well. So what happened in 2013? The government under this president, Erdogan, had a plan to do a lot of revitalization of the city. But part of what that meant was taking away green spaces. And green spaces are hard to come by. They're disappearing. There was a small protest by some environmentalists who basically sat in the park called Gezi Park and read books. That was their protest. Gradually, the police started irritating them, started to perhaps tear gas them, and because of the publicity to that, many, many, many more people started joining them. So all kinds of activists that were not only environmental activists, but anti-government activists, feminist activists, LGBTQ activists, many others, those who were fighting for minority rights, came together, and it became a massive movement across the entire country. So part of what was controversial was the disappearance of green spaces, and not only in the city, but up at the Black Sea, where the government eventually built a large bridge, and that meant taking over some protected land. So I'm going to show you, if you'll check the PowerPoint after this, I'm going to show you a video, which is a wonderful song by an Istanbul band who sang about the issues that were being protested about. And you'll see some images of the protests in that video. I wanted to explain a little of the symbolism in that video. One is, why are they banging pots and pans? Well, as the young protesters went to the streets, there were people who were in the apartment buildings surrounding them that would lean out their windows and doors and bang pots and pans in solidarity with the protesters. So that's that symbolism. There are also cats in the video. That's because street cats are very common in Istanbul, so it's more about Istanbul than it is about the protests. There's also some penguins at the end. What does that mean? What that means is that when the protests started, CNN Turkey decided to show a documentary about penguins rather than covering the protests. And this angered the protesters and their allies, obviously. And so the penguin became the symbol of the movement. So I hope you'll enjoy that video, and it gives you a little bit of a street scene. It's a side street in the center of Istanbul. Before we move into talking about research methods, I want to mention that the material from Chapter 1 is going to be interwoven across the semester. And I do want to mention the importance of the 3 theoretical perspectives that you read about: conflict theory, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. Let me say something very briefly about each of those, but again, they're going to be woven across the semester, so you will get to know them a little better. Conflict theory basically stems from Karl Marx's theories, where he, if you remember, talks about the fact that we are divided into 2 classes. Think about that video that you saw about Charlie Chaplin, that we are divided into the owners, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, the working class, the people that Charlie Chaplin represents there. His theory was that basically the history of the world has been this history of class conflict, because groups have their own interests, and those interests conflict with one another. So what the owner wants, think back to that video, right? What the owner wants is to have workers that work faster, that don't even have to stop for lunch. If you watch the whole movie, they have an invention of a feeding machine that comes to feed the workers so they don't even have to get up for lunch. And it actually ends up in a disaster with food splashing all over his face. So conflict theory is not only about class conflict, it then has gotten used over the years to talk about conflict between all kinds of groups, right? Group interests that are in conflict with one another. Think about the protests right now, how conflict theory would have something to say about those. Next is structural functionalism. And this is a theory that it's good for you to know about. I want to say that it's not that popular anymore, and so you don't really hear about a lot of structural functionalisms, functionalist theories these days, and theorists these days. But let's talk about what it is, because it may have some usefulness in some situations still. This comes out of Emil Durkheim's work, and what it says is picture society as if it's a human body. Okay, and Herbert Spencer was someone who came up with this idea as well. So if that's true, think about the fact that the hand has a different function than the nose, which has a different function than the eyes, which has a different function than the skin. So you have all of these differentiated parts in your body that are interdependent on one another. So without one, the other one may not work as well or may have to overcompensate for the other. And so this whole idea of harmony between interfunctioning parts is what structural functionalism is all about, right? How is modern society, with all its differentiated parts, economic system, political system, educational system, housing, all kinds of ways in which there's specialties in our society, and without one, the other isn't going to function so well. So it really has to do with that interdependence, and if there is some kind of disruption, then the society has to some kind of come back together and go back into equilibrium, as it says. So think about structural functionalism and how that may or may not be useful in trying to understand and explain some things. And the other one of the three is symbolic interactionism, that often gets attributed to Max Weber, although he didn't really use the term, and it's really some later theorists that developed it into a theory. But the reason it gets pinned on Weber is that he really focused on the whole way that we are cultural creatures and we are people with these systems of meaning. And so trying to understand society is trying to understand the meaning that individual human beings give to their actions. What symbolic interactionism does is it is more as a micro theory. Remember the difference between macro and micro? The conflict theory and structural functionalism are more macro theories. So symbolic interactionism is micro. And we're going to get into this in more detail in a couple of chapters. It's a very interesting theory, but the idea is how can we understand these very small interactions between people that happen? How do we use symbols with one another? How does language work? How do we make decisions individually? How does small groups communicate with one another? If we were in the classroom, I would be looking at you and talking about all of your symbolism that you are wearing, such as ECU on your baseball caps or your sweatshirts or t-shirts this time of year, right? So we would also talk about the roles that we play. So more about that soon, and I hope those three, that this gives you a bit of a sense of what they're like. But I want to say that these days, I and several other, well, a number of sociologists say we've got to move beyond those three. Our textbooks really are centered around those three theories, but there are many more theories out there, and we've got to break those down and say, look, we need to have more realization of how diverse sociology is theoretically. And you read about several of the more recent theories, such as feminist theory, postmodernist theory, queer theory. There's also something called critical race theory. And I'm not going to test you on all these theories this week, but I want you to understand them, read through what the textbook says. Postmodernism, as you read, is a reaction against modernism, against, for example, the scientific revolution. As much as we really need science, and they don't dispute that we need science, they're saying, did science and technology really save us as much as the modernists thought it would, right? Yes, we have a lot more medicine, but what did we do with that technology? We built bombs. We became more efficient at killing people. We, almost destroyed the world in World War II with nuclear weapons. So postmodernism is really asking us to scale back our hope in some of those modern technological scientific tools as if the tools themselves are somehow going to improve the world in large scale. The sociological imagination, which you read about, think about that as to be about how a problem or a situation might initially appear to be a personal problem, but it's actually a public issue. And C. Wright Mills used the example of the Great Depression, that there were people who lost their jobs, and it turned out it wasn't because they were a bad worker or because they had an argument with their boss. It was because the economy tanked. Same thing with the Great Recession that we had in 2008. So now think about that in today's climate. If you have a job loss because of COVID-19, it might feel like a personal failure, but why is it happening? Your neighbor is also losing their jobs. Other students are losing their jobs. So clearly, there's some public issues. And what are they? Here's some ideas for you. We have a pandemic we weren't prepared for. How does that expose other public issues, such as the vulnerability of aspects of our economy built around certain industries like oil, like the stock markets, like other commodities? Even higher education is at risk, right? Have we thought about whether there should have been some kind of a safety net for colleges and universities so that we're not tuition dependent? How does it expose the gaps in our healthcare systems? How about the importance of small businesses in our economy? Should there be a safety net for small businesses? So lots to think about. So make sure you understand the sociological imagination, as this is going to help you really get the basic idea of sociology. I want to say something about the women who were not in the three towering figures of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. Why weren't they? It's not because they weren't doing sociological work, those who were able to get an education. It's because they couldn't get academic positions. Women weren't being hired to be faculty members. So I just want to mention two of those who we are reading now and seeing how important they were really to the founding of sociology. One was Jane Addams. Anybody who's taken a social work course may know that she was the founder of social work. She worked in Chicago. She did a lot of work with immigrants, with women. And she not only founded something called the Hull House, which was a service organization, basically a residence where people who were in need could get help. But she also did research. She wrote about the people in need that she met every day in her work. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is another one. Some of you are familiar with her because you may have read the book The Yellow Wallpaper in an English class. So we are reading her ideas with fresh eyes now. She identified as a sociologist, and one of her works was called Women in Economics. And she talked about how the modern economic system is built on household labor, women's labor, as free labor, and that labor enables the market economy, enables men to go to work. And she questioned this. In her book, one of her points was, why is it that humans are the only animals where the female isn't responsible for her own livelihood, for going after her own food, right? Like birds and squirrels do, which they're doing right now in my yard. Okay, so let's move into research methods. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Most of the information is on the PowerPoint for you. But one question is, how do we narrow in on a research topic? when we're interested in doing something sociological. And wait 1 second, I need to power up my computer quickly. You may have heard this in another class before, but there is something called inductive and deductive reasoning. So I'm going to give you a second to try to remember what those are before I come at you. All right, so inductive reasoning is where you identify a topic for a research based on your experience, things you observe. So, for example, you go down the street and you notice that there are homeless people asking for money, and we're seeing that in Greenville, right? And you decide, I think I'm going to do a research project on homelessness in Greenville. And then you go from there and you figure out how you're going to study this. Are you going to survey them? Are you going to interview them? Are you going to go and maybe volunteer at the homeless shelter and observe people? Are you going to interview the executives of the homeless shelter? Are you going to perhaps interview the city council members to see how they're dealing with it? So many ways in which you could approach that question. There's not one way to do it as a sociologist. You could decide to do a survey of all people in Greenville and how do they feel about homelessness. You could do a survey of people to find out how secure their housing is. So that is what we would call inductive. Deductive is where you have some kind of preconceived idea that you've likely gotten from previous research. You have been reading a study about homelessness in New York, and you ask yourself, I wonder how homelessness works in Greenville and how it's different from that. And maybe that study had a particular theory that it was using or a particular idea that you wanted to test out. So the theory there is that in New York, the rapid rise in housing costs did not correlate with the stagnation in wages. And that was why there were homeless people there. So you think, let me see if that's true in Greenville. Let me see if we have rising housing prices and stagnant wages. And then find out if there's some kind of way that's connected to rising rates of homelessness. I hope that helps. That's the deductive style. So you're starting with an idea that's come from elsewhere. It might also be a theory that you've come up on your own from reading a lot of things, not just one study. I'll mention the research that I have done and some of the methods I've used. I wrote a book with two friends of mine called Immigration and Women. And what we did was we were interested in knowing more about what it's like to be an immigrant if you're a woman, and can we find out how it happens in various locations across the United States, including places that are called new gateways for immigrants. And some of those new gateways are places like Atlanta, Georgia, Baltimore, Maryland, some cities that weren't the traditional places where large waves of immigrants came. So if you look back in history, many immigrants settled in Chicago, in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. These were some of the big ports, but we have a lot more now spread out, and North Carolina is one of those gateways as well. And how we came to this was that we were all active in research and activism for immigrant women in the Baltimore area, and we came together and started doing activism, and then started doing research together. So how do we do this book? What we did was we divided up the task, and between the three of us, we did in-depth interviews with about 90 women, actually 89 women, across the United States. We went to several cities, didn't get to go to all of them, obviously, but some of these places like Houston, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore. I interviewed someone by phone actually in San Francisco. And so those in depth interviews, then from those, we came together and we analyzed them to see what are the themes, what kinds of themes are there that we can write about. And we divided the book into the sort of different occupational categories that the women are in. And one is domestic work. One is women who are starting their own businesses, and we made the argument that this is understudied, that not much attention has been given to women who are entrepreneurs, immigrant women who are entrepreneurs. It's mainly men. We also interviewed women who were first in their field for women who are entering the oil industry, architecture, and some of these fields. So that became our book, Immigration and Women, Understanding the American Experience. Another more recent project I've done has been with the city of Princeville, North Carolina, which is just up the road from us. You might know it, right next to Tarboro. And I became interested in this because I work on something called collective memory, that I'll talk more about soon, and race, especially African American collective memory. And I was interested in this town because it is the first chartered African American town in the United States. And it came about right after the Civil War when a lot of these independent black towns were founded. And it's one of the few that survived out of several hundred. Princeville, I found out, is really not well known by a lot of people. It got a lot of attention in 1999 because it was almost destroyed by Hurricane Floyd, and it's also been almost destroyed recently by Hurricane Matthew. So my research involved working with a graduate student to read a lot of old newspaper accounts, archival research, to follow recent news about Princeville, and to do some interviews with people. And I got the chance to collaborate with some young activists in Princeville who are wanting to bring the town back. And they have organized a huge homecoming for people around the country who are from Princeville to come back this August. And obviously, because of the virus, that has had to be postponed until next year. And some of you may have seen this if you were on campus, but my collaborators and I put together a grant-funded museum exhibit that went into the library about Princeville. And that is something that we are then going to send up to Princeville for them to use in a new mobile museum, which then can travel the state and it basically let people know more about the town. If you read through the PowerPoint, we go through various social research methods, and I hope those are clear. I want to mention just one, which is research into social media. How can social media be a research source? And this is something that is really, as you can probably imagine, a new and evolving field, but it's something that we can look at both quantitatively and qualitatively. There are now computer programs for big data that can take massive amounts of tweets, Facebook posts, other things, and spit out some data, find some correlations there, some trends, some things that have happened over time. So that's one way that it's being researched. There are also people who are using it in a qualitative way. There's ethnography that's going on where you do more in-depth look at social media posts and look for words, look for themes, look for trends, look for how men are using certain words versus how women are using certain words. So there's a lot to be mined there, and we're really at the beginning of trying to understand it. When we get to the section on groups and interaction in a couple of days, we'll talk more about social media, because another aspect of social media that is fascinating for sociologists is the way that social networks operate. So with that, I'm going to send you back to read the PowerPoint and make sure that you understand this chapter on research methods, including things like ethics in research, how we want to make sure that people's rights are protected, just like the medical researchers do. And I will see you tomorrow. Thank you.